I have been a veterans escort volunteer for 11 years. I ride with them in transport vans, I walk them through lobby doors, I sit in waiting rooms while men with titanium rods where their femurs used to be fill out intake forms. I am not a doctor. I am not a soldier. I am a retired schoolteacher from Mercer County who signed up to drive old men to their appointments and ended up doing something I did not have a word for until that November night at Halcyon Ridge. I was not supposed to be there past 8 o'clock. The call had come in at 6:40, a 23-year-old named Private Doyle, blast injury casualty, transferred from a forward aid station, deteriorating in transit. His escort was supposed to be a younger volunteer, a man named Curtis who had a bad knee and could not make the run in time. So they called me. I picked Private Doyle up at the airfield transfer point, sat beside the stretcher in the back of the van, and watched the paramedic work his chest with practiced hands all the way down Route 9. The boy's face was gray. His oxygen numbers were bad and getting worse, and every time the medic adjusted the mask, Doyle's eyes would flutter open and close again like he was trying to decide whether it was worth the effort to stay. We came through the ambulance bay at Halcyon Ridge at 7:14. The charge attending met us at the trauma bay doors, a tall man named Dr. Voss, silver at the temples, the kind of physician who moved through a hospital like he owned the floor beneath his feet. He took one look at the monitor readings, rattled off 3 orders to the team behind him, and swept Private Doyle's stretcher through the double doors before I had finished signing the transfer sheet. I stayed in the corridor the way escorts always do, outside the glass, watching through the long window that ran beside the bay. There was a young nurse at the station to my left, filling out what looked like admission paperwork. She had dark hair pulled back, teal scrubs, a stethoscope looped at her collar. She could not have been more than 26 or 27. She glanced once through the bay window at the cluster of staff around Doyle's bed, then turned back to her forms. I remember thinking she looked like she was waiting for someone to give her something to do. I did not think about her again for 37 minutes. Inside the bay, Dr. Voss was working. He had his team, a senior resident, 2 nurses I did not know, a respiratory tech, and they moved the way trauma teams move, fast and choreographed, the monitor beeping a rhythm I did not like. Doyle's oxygen saturation read 61 on the wall display and I watched Dr. Voss call for an airway adjustment, a second 4-line, a medication I could not read from the corridor. The team responded. The numbers did not climb. I have stood outside enough trauma bays to know when a room is struggling. There is a quality to the silence between the beeps, a way the team's movements slow just slightly at the edges, not panic, not incompetence, something more like the particular stillness of very good people working very hard and not gaining ground. I saw that stillness settle over Dr. Voss's shoulders at roughly 7:38. He called for a consultation, stepped back from the bed for 10 seconds, stepped forward again. The respiratory tech made an adjustment. Doyle's numbers held at 64. I looked away from the window. My hands were cold. I had escorted 4 soldiers who did not make it home from Halcyon Ridge in 11 years of volunteering, and I knew what that corridor felt like in the minutes before it happened. I did not want to know it again with a 23-year-old boy on the other side of the glass. That was when I noticed the young nurse was no longer at the station. She was inside the bay. I do not know when she crossed through the doors. I do not know whether she said anything to Dr. Voss or simply moved past him in the controlled chaos of the room. What I saw, when I turned back to the window, was a young woman in teal scrubs standing at the supply cart near the head of Doyle's bed, and she had a book open on the cart's surface. Not a chart. Not a protocol binder. A small, worn book, maybe 100 pages, its cover dark with age, its spine soft the way spines go soft after decades of handling. She had one hand flat on its open page and the other already moving to adjust the position of Doyle's head and neck in a way I had never seen a nurse do. Dr. Voss turned. He said something I could not hear through the glass. She answered without looking up from the book, her hands continuing their work with a steadiness that did not match the numbers on the monitor, or the gray in Doyle's face, or the tight silence of the room. She shifted the angle of the bed. She placed her palms against Doyle's ribcage in a positioning I did not recognize, deliberate, measured, both hands working in a slow rhythm against the chest wall while the respiratory tech watched with an expression I can only describe as careful attention. Whatever she was doing, it was not in any protocol the tech had memorized. Dr. Voss stepped toward her. She did not stop. She kept her hands moving, her eyes going between the open page and Doyle's face and the monitor, back and forth, unhurried, like a musician reading from a score she had studied for years but never yet performed. Dr. Voss leaned over the book. I saw him go still. The monitor climbed to 69. Then 73. Then, slowly, like a tide coming in, 81. I had pressed my palm flat against the corridor wall without realizing it. The respiratory tech said something to the resident. The resident looked at the monitor, then at the nurse, then at the book on the cart. Dr. Voss straightened up and stood where he was, his hands at his sides, and did not speak. The monitor read 91 when Private Doyle took a breath on his own. Not the managed breath of a machine, not the shallow reflexive flutter I had watched for the last 40 minutes, a real breath, chest rising, held for a full second, released. He took another. Then another. The nurse's hands did not move from the position she had locked them into until the fourth breath came, steady and full, and then she eased back and looked at the monitor and simply nodded once, to herself, the way a person nods when something they trusted turns out to be true. Dr. Voss said something. She answered. He picked up the book from the cart, carefully, the way you pick up something that does not belong to you, and stood reading a page that I could not see for a long moment. Then he set it back down, and he looked at her, and I watched him try to find words and not quite find them. I heard a sound beside me in the corridor and turned. An older nurse had come out of the bay, one of the ones who had been on Voss's team, and she was standing 2 feet from me with her back against the wall, and her eyes were wet. She was not crying. She was simply standing there with her eyes wet, looking at the window, and she said, not to me but to the hallway, where did she learn that? I did not have an answer. I went back to watching. The team moved Doyle to the ICU at 8:40, and the young nurse went with him to manage the transition, the book tucked under her arm now, held against her side like you'd carry a hymnal. I followed the corridor to the ICU waiting area the way escorts do, found a chair by the nurse's station, and sat down. I have a habit, when I am waiting, of reaching into my jacket pocket for the photograph I carry there. It is not a large photograph, 4 inches by 3, black and white, the edges worn soft. My father gave it to me in 1987, 6 months before he died. He had carried it in his own wallet since 1953, the year he came home from Korea. He never told me much about the war. He told me this, that in the winter of 1952, in a MASH unit outside the Imjin River Valley, a respirator failed during a mass casualty event and an army nurse kept 3 men breathing through a 4-hour night using nothing but her hands and a technique she had written down in a journal she carried in her field bag. He said she had reddish hair and worked without speaking and had the stillest hands he had ever seen on a living person. He said he believed she saved his life. He said he never learned her name. The photograph shows a young woman in army nurse whites, standing in front of a MASH tent, looking into the camera with the composed expression of someone who has already seen the worst the day has to offer and is not afraid of what comes next. My father wrote one thing on the back, in pencil, in 1953, she kept her hands still. I was holding the photograph when the young nurse came out of Doyle's room. She stopped at the nurse's station, set the worn book on the counter, began writing her notes. I looked at the book's cover. I looked at the photograph in my hand. I looked at the book again. The cover bore a name in faded ink, handwritten in the neat block letters of a different era, E. Dowd, Army Nurse Corps, 1951. My father's MASH unit had been attached to the 8th Army in the winter of 1952. I do not know how long I sat without moving. Long enough that the nurse looked up from her notes and found me staring. She had the composed expression of someone waiting for me to say whatever it was I was going to say. I stood up. I crossed the 3 steps to the counter. I set the photograph down beside the book, face up, so she could see it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up, carefully, the way you pick something up when your hands are not entirely steady, and she turned it over and read the penciled line on the back, and she set it down, and she pressed both palms flat on the counter and looked at the window across the room and did not speak. That is from 1952, I said. Outside the Imjin River Valley. She nodded, very slowly. My father, I said, told me she kept her hands still. The ICU was quiet around us. At the nurse's station, 2 other staff members had gone motionless, listening. Down the corridor, the attending, Dr. Voss, had come out of a patient room and stood in the hallway, watching. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms and the November rain ran down the window at the end of the hall, and the whole ward held itself still around this young woman and an old man and a photograph her grandmother had never known would find its way back to her. After a while she said, she never talked about Korea. She always said the journal was just notes. The journal saved my father's life, I said. And tonight it saved that boy's. She looked down at the worn cover with its faded name and its 50-year-old ink. She did not cry. She did not speak again for a long time. But I watched her reach out and place her hand flat on the journal's cover, the same way she had placed it on the open page in the bay, still, steady, sure, and I thought about a young woman in army white standing in front of a canvas tent in the Korean winter, keeping her hands still while the machines failed around her, writing down what she knew so it would not be lost. It was not lost. I left Halcyon Ridge at 9:10. Dr. Voss stopped me in the lobby on my way out. He was a formal man, not given to sentiment, and he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and he said, carefully, that he had never seen the technique performed, had not known it existed, and that in his judgment it was the reason Private Doyle was breathing. He said it like a man confessing something. I nodded. I told him the nurse's grandmother had been an army nurse in Korea, and that she had written down everything she knew, and that her granddaughter had read every page. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she shouldn't have been on intake paperwork tonight. I did not say anything to that. I drove home on Route 9 in the rain and I thought about my father, who came home from a frozen valley in 1952 because a young woman kept her hands still and wrote everything down. And I thought about the granddaughter she had left behind, a young nurse in teal scrubs, carrying a worn journal in a hospital bag, waiting without knowing she was waiting for the one night it would matter. Some debts take 70 years to come full circle. Some gifts we carry our whole lives before we understand what they were for.